In 1999, Eleanor Whitfield spent 4.5 hours calculating the roof load distribution for the Whitfield Construction headquarters on a drafting table wedged into the corner of a spare bedroom in Haverford, Pennsylvania. She worked by the light of a single lamp, her coffee going cold beside her pencil moving across vellum with the quiet authority of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She caught a critical error in the lateral support calculations. At 2 a.m. corrected it, recalculated the entire eastern facade, and had the revised drawings ready by 6. Richard presented those drawings to the Philadelphia City Council that same morning and received a standing ovation. 24 years later, Eleanor sat in the boardroom of that same building and heard her name spoken aloud for the first time in a legal proceeding. It appeared in a 30-day eviction notice. The room smelled of floor wax and expensive cologne. The mahogany table at its center was the same one she had selected from a furniture house in Center City back in 1998, chosen because the grain pattern had a structural elegance she found pleasing. She had run her hand across samples for 2 hours before making the decision. Nobody in this room knew that. Nobody in this room had ever asked. Lawrence Holt, the family attorney, sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents arranged with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, and possessed the particular talent of delivering devastating information in a voice that suggested he was reading a utility bill. Eleanor had never liked him. Richard had hired him in 2004, and she had noted even then the way Lawrence directed all conversation toward her husband, as though she were a decorative element of the room rather than a party to the marriage he was helping to administer. Connor sat to Lawrence's left. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, in a charcoal suit with the kind of surface confidence that reads as competence until you look at it too closely. He had his father's jaw and his father's habit of checking his watch when other people were speaking. Diane sat across from him, her expression arranged into something that resembled neutrality, but was. Eleanor had long since learned a mask she wore when she already knew the outcome of a situation and was simply waiting for it to conclude. Lawrence cleared his throat and began. The first item was the Haverford estate. Eleanor listened as he explained that the property assessed at $4.5 million had been transferred in full to Connor Whitfield in March of 2023. The language was precise and uninflected. Eleanor did the arithmetic without being asked. March of 2023 was 14 months before Richard's death. It was also the month she had driven him to Penn Medicine 14 times for chemotherapy infusions, sitting in the waiting room with a book she never read, making sure he had water and crackers for the ride home. She did not make a sound. The second item was Whitfield Construction. 100% of shares divided equally between Connor and Diane. Lawrence's voice moved through the clauses with the rhythm of a man who had read them many times in private. There was no mention of the $50,000 Eleanor had contributed in 1985. No mention of the inheritance she had transferred from her grandmother's estate, the entire financial foundation upon which Whitfield Construction had been built. That sum existed nowhere in the documents Lawrence was reading. It had been absorbed, spent, compounded into something worth millions, and then carefully erased from the record of how it began. Eleanor looked at Diane while Lawrence spoke. Her daughter's face did not change at any point during the reading. Not at the transfer of the house, not at the division of the company, not at the mention of the $50,000 omission that Diane would have known about if she had ever asked a single question about how her parents' company had started. She did not ask because she had never needed to. The answer would have complicated something she preferred to keep simple. Diane had known. Not just today. She had known for a long time, and she had kept it from her mother while sitting at Sunday dinners in a house Eleanor had designed, and eating food Eleanor had cooked, and accepting a life that Eleanor had quietly, consistently, invisibly funded. The third item was the no contest clause. If Eleanor challenged any provision of the will in any legal proceeding, she would forfeit the single remaining provision, made in her name a monthly stipend of $1,200. Lawrence explained this without irony. Richard had constructed it knowing exactly what it meant. Eleanor did not have the resources to hire an attorney capable of dismantling a will this thoroughly prepared. Richard had known her financial position better than she did because he had managed their money for 4 decades with the specific intention of ensuring she would never have enough to fight him. The no contest clause was not a legal formality. It was a door he had locked from the inside before leaving the building. Lawrence finished speaking and folded his hands. Connor picked up a manila envelope from the table and slid it across the polished wood toward her. Inside was a check for $1,200 and a formal notice of eviction from the Haverford property effective in 30 days. Eleanor looked at the envelope without touching it. Then she looked at her son. "Connor," she said, and her voice was level in the way that water is level when the pressure beneath it has nowhere to go. "Do you remember the Rosendale Bridge, the retrofit, 1992? He looked up from his portfolio for the first time. There was a load calculation error in the Northern Pier Foundation. The differential settlement under freeze-thaw cycling would have caused a measurable tilt within the first winter. If that project had failed, it would have been the first major contract Whitfield Construction ever lost. The company was not large enough to survive that at the time." She paused. "I found the error at 11 o'clock the night before the filing deadline. I corrected it. I recalculated the entire foundation sequence by 3 in the morning. Your father submitted the corrected drawings at 9 a.m. and signed a contract worth $400,000 before noon." The room was very quiet. Connor looked at her for a moment and then looked back down at his portfolio. "Dad signed the permits," he said. "That was all. Not a denial, not a challenge, a dismissal." He acknowledged what she had said was true and then indicated without using the words that the truth did not constitute a claim. She had done the work. Richard had signed the permits. The permits were what mattered. Eleanor did not respond. There was nothing left to say to that because he was right about the system even while being entirely wrong about everything else. Connor stood and nodded to one of the junior associates near the door. The associate walked to the glass display case along the far wall and opened it. Inside was the architectural model Eleanor had built of the Whitfield Construction headquarters, a structure she had spent 6 weeks constructing from balsa wood and wire, and small panes of glass working from her own drawings filling in the details that existed in her mind and nowhere else. It had been displayed in that case since 2001, the year the building won a Pennsylvania Sustainable Design Commendation that Richard had accepted at a ceremony in Harrisburg without bringing her along. The associate carried the model into the hallway. Eleanor heard the sound it made when it hit the bottom of the metal trash receptacle, the crack of the wood frame, the small secondary sound of the glass panels following. Connor was already walking toward the door and did not turn around. Diane was looking at her phone. Eleanor sat with her hands flat on the mahogany table and breathed. She had designed the table too. She thought about that for a moment. The grain running left to right, the weight of it solid and specific. She thought about the afternoon she had spent at the furniture house running her hands across sample after sample in the particular satisfaction of finding the one that was right. That was what people who had never designed anything did not understand about her. It was never about the credit. It was about the rightness of a thing, the satisfaction of a calculation that held a line that landed where it was supposed to land. She had spent 41 years building things that were right, and every one of them had someone else's name on it. She picked up the manila envelope and put it in her bag and walked out. To understand what had been taken from Eleanor Whitfield, you need to go back to a Christmas party in Philadelphia in December of 1984, when she was 27 years old and already the most technically precise junior designer at the firm where she worked. The air in the party room smelled of pine and gin, and Richard Whitfield was standing near the window in a dark jacket, watching the room with the alert hunger of a man who understood that rooms like this one were where the future got decided. He was a small-town contractor from Lancaster County who had come to Philadelphia with alone a truck and a gift for making people feel that he was exactly what they needed. He was not technically sophisticated. He was charismatic in the way that certain structures are impressive from the street without having the bones to justify the facade. Eleanor saw the ambition in him and mistook it for vision. She was 27 and she had spent her entire life inside her own head, and she did not yet know the difference between a man who wanted to build something and a man who wanted to be seen building. They were married in June of 1985. 2 weeks after the wedding, Richard suggested she resign from the firm. The corporate world was cutthroat, he said. They were building something together and he needed her focus. He used the word partnership 11 times in that conversation. She counted later when she had learned to count things like that. She signed the transfer documents for her grandmother's $50,000 inheritance the same week. Richard said her name on the incorporation papers was a liability issue, a technicality, something they would correct when the time was right. She believed him because she was 28 and in love, and because the lie was constructed with the precision of something that had been planned for longer than she knew. They moved to Haverford and Eleanor set up a drafting table in a spare bedroom. and the routine of her erasure established itself with the patient efficiency of a slow leak. She was up before 5 every morning. Richard's blueprints spread across the kitchen table, the coffee steam rising over the structural errors she would spend the next 2 hours correcting. She learned to present her corrections as suggestions, framing them as questions, making him feel that the right answer had come from him. She learned to speak in the language of we while he mastered the language of I. It was a grammatical shift so gradual that she was well past the point of return before she recognized it as a pattern. By the 10th year of their marriage, her name had disappeared from every professional license associated with Whitfield Construction. Richard said it was for tax simplification, for insurance efficiency, for reasons that always sounded reasonable in the moment and left her slightly diminished in the aggregate. He introduced her at industry events as his lovely wife. She organized the dinners that secured the contracts. She managed the household that allowed him to focus entirely on his public ambitions. And in the hours before the house woke up, she fixed his drawings. There were 4 buildings that defined what had been taken from her. The house in Haverford was the first. She designed it on the kitchen table at 4 in the morning with her grandmother's money, and her own training. A photograph appeared in a local paper when construction finished. Richard stood in front of the building. Eleanor was in the frame, but cropped out in the published version. The Rosendale Bridge was the second. She had described the moment in the boardroom already: the pier foundation error, the 11 o'clock discovery, the 3 a.m. correction, the contract signed before noon. What she had not described was what Richard bought with the first payment from that contract: a Rolex. He presented it to himself at dinner, still in the box, pleased with the symmetry of the gesture. He did not mention her name. The Whitfield Construction headquarters was the third. She had designed the natural ventilation system that reduced the building's energy consumption by 40%, a technical achievement specific enough that it appeared in a city council report on sustainable development. The author of record was Richard H. Whitfield. Eleanor was listed as consulting assistant. The fourth building was the one that finally showed her what she had been too loyal to see. In 2019, she designed a sustainable residential community over 6 months, the most ambitious work of her career, a project she believed would finally be built under her own vision. Richard canceled the contract without explanation and transferred the project to Connor. Connor did not have the technical capacity to execute the design. The project stalled within 4 months and was eventually abandoned. Eleanor watched it die and said nothing because by then she had spent 34 years practicing silence, and she had become very good at it. She did not know until much later that 2019 was the year Richard and Lawrence Holt began meeting privately to restructure the estate. The project transfer was not incompetence. It was inventory management. Richard was moving assets before the accounting began. There was one other thing she had noticed and filed away and never allowed herself to examine too closely. In the years after 2010, Richard made occasional trips north to the Adirondacks. He said he was scouting for timber suppliers for hunting retreat properties, for the kind of rural investments that wealthy builders made when they had money to place and privacy to maintain. He came back with gray mountain mud on his boots and a particular locked expression that settled over his face whenever she came near the study after those trips. Once when she was dusting near the safe, she saw it open. Inside, there was a brass cylinder 12 inches long, oxidized to a deep green, and beside it, an iron key with a head shaped like a stylized floor. Richard closed the safe so quickly the edge of the door caught the tips of her fingers. He told her business documents were not her concern and left the room. She did not ask about it again. But the image of that cylinder stayed in her memory, the way certain structural details stay in a drawing present in every subsequent version, even when you think you have removed them. The 30 days that followed the boardroom meeting were a slow, methodical dismantling, conducted with the casual efficiency of people who had planned it in advance. Connor had a decorator in the house within 48 hours, measuring rooms, cataloging fixtures, speaking loudly about renovations in the specific way of someone who wants to be overheard. Eleanor moved through the house quietly, making herself small in the spaces she had designed, watching the mahogany furniture she had selected being evaluated for resale, and the gardens she had planted being measured for repaving. She did not cry. She made lists. Diane arrived in the second week with a clipboard and adhesive labels, red dots for items flagged for estate appraisal, and blue for personal property to be documented. She moved through each room with the systematic focus of an auditor, which in a sense she was. Eleanor followed at a measured distance and said nothing until Diane reached the study and picked up the silver compass that had lived on Eleanor's desk for the better part of 40 years. The compass had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. It was a small instrument 3 inches across with a case of brushed silver that had gone soft and warm with handling. On the underside, barely legible after a century, were the initials CMA and the year 1901. Eleanor had received it at 24, 2 years before she met Richard, a gift that preceded the marriage by enough time to be unambiguously hers. Diane pressed a red dot onto the compass case. "That belonged to my grandmother," Eleanor said. "I had it before I met your father. Everything in this house is an estate asset until documented otherwise." Diane did not look up. "That's how probate works. Your grandmother's name is not Whitfield. The object is not from this estate. Then document it." Eleanor took the compass from the table and put it in her pocket. Diane watched this happen and made a note on her clipboard and moved on to the next shelf. It was not a confrontation exactly. It was a recalibration of authority, a demonstration that in this house in this month, Eleanor's claim to her own history required proof. The following week, Eleanor came back from a walk along the road that curved past the lower garden and found her workroom empty. Not reorganized. Empty. The drafting table gone, the flat files gone, the shelves bare. Diane had sent a crew while Eleanor was outside. Gone with the rest of it was the rolled vellum that had contained Eleanor's original hand-drawn concept sketches for the Whitfield Construction Headquarters, 40 sheets of work from 1999 that existed nowhere else, that were the only physical record of the drawings before Richard's name had been placed on the copies submitted for permitting. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the empty room for 3 minutes. She did not move. She absorbed the dimensions of the loss with the same methodical attention she would give to a damaged wall, cataloging what was gone and what remained. What remained was the knowledge of how she had drawn those plans, the specific decisions, the load paths, the ventilation geometry. No one had taken that. It was not the kind of thing that could be put in a drawer. She went upstairs and opened her laptop and searched for the Colton County tax auction records she had bookmarked 3 months earlier without fully understanding why. The listing was still there. 22 acres in the Adirondack foothills, last sold in 1992, listed 4 times since, never held longer than 8 months by any owner. The parcel name in the county records was Devil's Spine, a designation that told you something about the topography before you looked at the survey maps. Starting bid was $5. The filing note from the county assessor read unstable terrain, no documented water access, repeated owner abandonment. Eleanor read that last phrase again. 4 owners, 32 years, all of them gone. The county framed this as a warning. Eleanor read it as information. 4 people had looked at this land and seen a problem they could not solve. That meant the land had a problem. It did not mean the problem was unsolvable. Those were different things, and the difference was the whole of her professional life. She printed the listing and folded it into her jacket pocket alongside the silver compass. On the last night in Haverford, the house was quiet in the way that emptied structures go quiet, the particular silence of rooms that have been stripped of the things that gave them acoustic texture. Eleanor sat in the corner of what had been her workroom, the only room Connor had not yet repainted, on a folding chair he had retrieved from the garage. She did not arrange the space around her. She sat in it as it was. She thought about this compass in her pocket. She thought about the listing in her jacket. She thought about what she had and what she did not have with the unsentimental precision she had applied to structural problems for 4 decades. She had $4,300 in a savings account she had maintained separately from the household finances, deposits of small amounts over 15 years, money extracted from grocery budgets and household accounts, with the patience of someone who was not sure what they were saving for but understood that the time might come when they would need to stand on their own. She had her drafting tools. 3 rolls of blank vellum, 41 years of accumulated knowledge that lived entirely in her body and her mind, the kind of knowledge that cannot be transferred, cannot be seized, cannot be entered into a probate record. She walked down the front hallway before turning off the lights. The mirror she had hung in 1989 was still there. She looked at it for a moment. She was 68 years old. Her hair had gone fully silver in her late 50s, and she had never attempted to change it, a decision Richard had interpreted as a lack of vanity, and she had made as a statement of something she could not quite name at the time. She looked at herself with the same directness she would apply to a drawing that needed an honest assessment. She turned off the light and did not look back. At 5 in the morning, she started the car. Connor's SUV was in the driveway, a black vehicle with a vanity plate that read WFLD BLD. Eleanor looked at it once, not with anger, but with the specific recognition of a structural engineer observing a building that has been constructed without understanding its own load-bearing requirements. Connor was operating a company whose internal architecture he had never bothered to learn. He had inherited the name and the contracts and the office furniture, and not one piece of the knowledge that had made any of it function. He would not understand the implications of that until much later, and by then it would be too late to address. Eleanor pulled out of the driveway and pointed the car north. On the dashboard, she had placed the silver compass. Its needle settled to true north with the unhesitating certainty of an instrument that has been making this same correction for longer than anyone alive can remember. She watched it for a moment and then kept her eyes on the road. The Adirondacks were 5 hours away. She had $4,000, a $5 deed to 22 acres of land 4 previous owners had abandoned, and 41 years of knowledge that no one had ever paid for. The state of New York was waiting with terrain that had broken better resourced people than her. Eleanor Margaret Whitfield drove toward it without hesitation because she had spent a lifetime solving problems other people had declared unsolvable, and she saw no particular reason to stop now. The gas station outside Catskill, New York smelled of diesel and cold morning air, and Eleanor Whitfield sat in her car at the pump with a paper napkin on her knee and a pen in her hand doing the only kind of math that mattered now. After the gas, $4,271. She wrote it down and worked beneath it. $5 for the land, $2,000 for minimum winter materials, and that was an optimistic number based on nothing more than what she believed she could manage alone. $1,800 for food over 6 months, calculated at $10 a day, which left no room for error. That brought her to $466 for everything she had not anticipated. In construction, the unanticipated was not an exception. It was the schedule. Any reasonable person looking at those numbers would have turned the car around. Eleanor flipped the napkin over and began to draw. She had not seen the land. She was working from the topographic survey she had studied on her phone the night before, from the county assessor's description, from 40 years of reading terrain in documents before she ever stood on it. The line she drew was not a plan. It was an instinct made visible, a structure that pressed itself against a rock face rather than fighting it, that used the mountain's geometry as its own foundation. She drew it in 3 minutes without lifting the pen, the kind of sketch that comes from a place below conscious thought. A woman behind the register, perhaps 60 years old with hands that showed decades of physical work, watched Eleanor through the window as she came in to pay. She looked at the napkin in Eleanor's hand. "You an architect?" she asked. Eleanor considered the question. "Used to be," she said. The woman counted back her change. "My husband said the same thing about carpentry after the paper mill closed in 2011. Said he used to be a carpenter. Now he builds furniture in the garage and sells it to stores in Manhattan." She pushed the coins across the counter. Took him about 6 months to stop saying "used to be." Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then took the change and the napkin and walked back to the car. She did not speak of it again, but she held the napkin differently on the passenger seat for the rest of the drive north, with the particular care you give to something that has unexpectedly become important. The 2-lane road into Colton climbed steadily after the last town of any size, the asphalt giving way to frost-heaved pavement that clicked under the tires like a conversation Eleanor was not meant to hear. The trees thickened and the sky narrowed between them, and the light changed in the way that mountain light changes in October, taking on a quality that is both colder and more honest than anything available at lower elevations. The GPS lost confidence somewhere after the second unmarked turnoff and offered a sequence of uncertain suggestions before going quiet entirely. Eleanor navigated by the survey map she had printed in the compass on the dashboard. She reached the gate of the Devil's Spine at 4 in the afternoon, with the light already beginning its early descent behind the western ridge. The gate itself was a section of cattle fencing, wired to 2 posts held closed by a chain, with no lock, which told her something about what the county thought of anyone attempting to trespass here. She unwired it, drove through, and got out to close it behind her. She stood for a moment and looked. 22 acres of granite outcroppings and tangled mountain laurel rose before her. In the late light, the rock faces catching the last direct sun and throwing it back in shades of gray and amber. A professional would have seen instability, inaccessibility, the accumulated failures of 4 previous attempts at use. Eleanor saw something different. She saw the way the slope organized itself into natural horizontal planes every 12 to 15 vertical feet. She saw the southeast exposure of the main face, which meant morning light and solar gain in winter. She saw the low point in the northwest corner, where the vegetation was distinctly darker and denser, which meant water collecting from somewhere above. She saw the tool shed. It was a structure from the early 1950s, tin-roof timber frame, maybe 6 feet wide and 10 feet deep. The roof had 4 visible holes from where she stood. The door hung open on one hinge. She walked to it and stepped inside and measured the interior with her steps. She noted the highest point of the dirt floor, the location of the worst roof failures, the direction the wind came from based on the weathering pattern on the exterior boards. Then she went back to the car and began unloading. She had a yoga mat, 3 wool blankets, her drafting bag, and a small box of food. She had a flashlight and a folding knife, and the rolled vellum and a change of clothes. She arranged these items in the tool shed with the systematic efficiency of someone who has learned that calm and organization are the same thing in a crisis, found a piece of heavy plastic in the brush 20 yards from the shed, and used rocks from the cliff base to pin it over the 2 worst holes in the roof. By 6 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 12 degrees. By 8, it was below freezing. Eleanor lay on the yoga mat with all 3 blankets in her jacket and listened to the tin roof contract in the cold, a sound like something organic and reluctant, and she understood for the first time in her adult life what it meant to have no one to call. Not because the people she might have called were unavailable, but because the act of calling any of them would have meant admitting that she had been wrong to come here, and she was not yet certain whether she had been wrong or simply premature, and the difference between those two things required surviving the night to determine. The cold did not break her. The silence did something more complicated. In 41 years of marriage, she had never been alone in this way, alone without the structural requirement of someone else's needs to organize her hours around. She had risen at 5 every morning to correct Richard's drawings, not because he asked her to, but because the alternative was watching his work fail, and his work failing would have meant the family failing, and the family had become the only architecture she was permitted to build. Now the family was gone. The work was gone. The house was gone. And the silence of the mountain pressed into the tool shed through the gaps in the boards and found her without any of those things to hide behind. The grief arrived the way structural failures arrive in buildings that have been quietly compromised for years all at once and from everywhere simultaneously. She cried in a way she had not permitted herself to cry in the boardroom, or during the 30 days in Haverford, or during the 5-hour drive north. It was not a graceful thing. It was the sound of someone who had held a weight for so long that the muscles responsible for holding it had forgotten they were doing it, and the sudden release was indistinguishable from collapse. She cried for the $50,000 and the 41 years and the Rosendale Bridge and the model in the trash can and the workroom cleaned out while she was walking along the road. She cried for the 27-year-old woman at the Christmas party who had been so certain that partnership meant something. She cried until the cold made it impractical to continue. At 2 in the morning, she sat up and breathed and looked at the star field visible through the largest remaining hole in the roof. The Adirondack sky at elevation in October, absent any competing light source, is not a modest thing. It presented itself to her with the fullness of something that has been there the entire time and simply required the removal of everything else before it could be seen properly. She thought about the next concrete step. Not the cabin, not the survey, not Martin Graves or Lawrence Holt or the no contest clause or the check for $1,200 still folded inside the manila envelope in her bag. The next step. She needed to cover the 2 remaining roof holes before tomorrow night's temperature drop. She had seen a second piece of corrugated plastic near the tree line. In the morning, she would retrieve it. That was the step, just that one. She lay back down and held the silver compass in her right hand and was asleep within minutes. The morning came without ceremony. A thin band of light moved through the hole she had not yet patched and crossed the dirt floor and found the silver compass in her hand, and the small movement of that light was enough to bring her up from sleep with a clarity that surprised her. She was stiff from the cold and the ground. Her hip ached where the yoga mat had compressed against a ridge in the floor. She was hungry in the straightforward way of someone who has not eaten since a gas station granola bar the afternoon before. She stepped outside. The eastern face of the main cliff caught the first direct light of the sun, and where a natural quartz vein ran diagonally across the granite from northeast to southwest, The light broke into prismatic color, a brief and wordless demonstration of what the rock contained. Eleanor stood in the cold with her jacket half zipped and looked at the vein and the way it indicated the interior composition of the cliff face. The quartz ran at roughly 45 degrees, intersecting three distinct strata of material, and where it crossed the lower formation, the granite had a blue-gray undertone that was different from the surrounding stone. She walked to the base of the cliff and put her hand flat against it. The stone under her palm was cold and specific. It had the density of something formed under enormous and patient pressure. The kind of density that does not announce itself but communicates through weight and resistance. Eleanor had worked with building stone for 4 decades. She knew the difference between decorative stone and structural stone, between stone that looked impressive and stone that held. This felt like the second kind in a way that made her keep her hand there longer than was necessary. She retrieved the sketchbook from her drafting bag and started at the beginning. 3 days passed in a rhythm of physical labor and careful observation. She cleared brush from the base of the cliff with the hand axe she had found in the garage at Haverford and brought without knowing why. She mapped the natural drainage patterns with a notebook and a measuring tape. She located the point where the morning light arrived earliest and the point where it held longest in the afternoon. She was not yet building. She was reading in the way that you read a complex drawing before you touch it with a pencil. On the third morning, Martin Graves arrived. He drove a white pickup truck that was too clean for a county road this remote, and he got out with the relaxed confidence of a man who had rehearsed the opening of this conversation. He was 55, ruddy-faced, dressed in the particular way of rural professionals who want to signal that they are serious without seeming urban. He introduced himself as a local real estate consultant, said he had heard about the new owner of the Devil's Spine, said he wanted to make sure she understood the county procedures for a property with unresolved mineral rights dating to the original homestead filing. Eleanor looked at him without responding immediately. He explained, the original homestead claim from 1920 had included a mineral rights declaration that had never been formally transferred through the subsequent tax auction proceedings. If the new owner did not file for confirmation of those rights within 60 days of purchase, they would revert to county administration by default. He said, in a position to assist with that process. His fee was 15% of the assessed value of whatever mineral interests were confirmed. Eleanor said, how long have you known about the mineral rights on this property? He smiled the smile of a man who expected the question and had an answer ready. Word gets around in a small county. This land has been on the county tax rolls for 32 years. In that time, 4 separate owners have come and gone without anyone mentioning mineral rights to them. I purchased it 4 days ago. You drove 40 minutes up a mountain road to welcome me to the neighborhood. She watched his face. That is not how word gets around. That is surveillance. Graves did not answer immediately. His eyes moved to the cliff face behind her, and in that movement she saw everything she needed to see. He knew what was in that cliff. He had known before she arrived, and he had been waiting to see how long it would take her to leave. I'll be in touch, he said, and got back in the truck. Eleanor watched him go. Then she went directly to her car and found the folder with the tax auction documents and looked at the mineral rights transfer section. The field was blank. Intentionally or by clerical error, she could not determine. What she could determine was that she had 57 days remaining to file. She had no attorney, and she had just under $400 beyond her basic survival budget to address the problem. That evening, she used the satellite connection on Thomas Briggs' phone to call the Cornell Cooperative Extension Legal Assistance Line, which she had found listed on a county resource document at the Colton Post Office. She described the situation to the intake volunteer in precise terms and was told she would receive a callback. The callback came the following morning. The person on the other end was not a lawyer. My name is Dr. Patricia Okafor, the voice said. I'm in the Applied Geology Division at Cornell. Your intake description was flagged to me because of the 1920 homestead reference. Do you have anything from the original claim? Any physical documentation still on the property? Eleanor looked at the cliff face from where she stood. I don't know yet, she said. I haven't finished looking. The next 2 days she searched with the methodical attention she had once given to checking Richard's structural calculations. She cleared the base of the cliff in sections working from south to north, removing the accumulated debris of decades' dead leaves, broken branches, or collapsed sections of old wire fencing, a section of rusted pipe. On the afternoon of the second day, she was working on a drainage channel along the north face when her shovel struck something that was neither rock nor soil. The sound it produced was hollow and metallic with a resonance that carried differently than the surrounding material. She put the shovel down and used her hands. The door was less than 2 feet square. It was set into a natural hollow in the cliff face where the rock formed an overhang deep enough to shelter whatever was inside from direct weather exposure. The wood of the door had compressed and darkened over decades but had not rotted through, protected by the overhang and the particular microclimate of the hollow. The iron hinges had oxidized to a deep orange that almost looked deliberate. Eleanor pulled the door open. The cylinder sat on a flat shelf of rock inside the hollow and set back far enough to remain dry even in horizontal rain. It was 12 inches long and the diameter of a large flashlight, and the copper had oxidized over a century to the specific shade of green that Eleanor recognized from the image burned into her memory. The safe in Richard's study, the door swinging closed on her fingers, the object she had seen for less than 3 seconds and never been permitted to examine. Richard had been here. He had found this hollow, or he had known it existed, and he had chosen not to tell her. The fact of that concealment sitting in her hands in the form of a green copper cylinder was more clarifying than anything Lawrence Holt had read from a document in a mahogany boardroom. She carried the cylinder to the flat granite shelf at the base of the cliff and sat down and began working at the wax seal that had kept the interior pressurized for 100 years. It gave way in sections, the wax dry and brittle, and when the cap finally separated from the body, the air that escaped smelled of old parchment and mineral dust, and something she could not name, the smell of a message that had been waiting longer than she had been alive. Inside was a rolled bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Eleanor unrolled them in her lap with the same careful deliberateness she had used on her most fragile drawings, the ones where the vellum had gone translucent with age and the pencil lines were the only thing holding the paper together. The first document was a surveyor's map dated 1920, drawn in blue-black ink on heavy vellum that had remained supple in the sealed environment. It was a professional document, precise and systematic, the work of someone with formal training. It showed the 22-acre parcel in complete topographic detail, and running beneath it, marked in a heavier line, with a notation Eleanor had to read twice before she trusted her own understanding, was a continuous mineral spring formation that crossed the entire property from the northeast corner to the southwest drainage point. A water right of this age, documented in a formal survey and associated with an original homestead, claim that had never been legally dissolved, was not a minor asset. Eleanor knew enough property law to understand that. She did not know the exact figure, but she knew the word substantial was too small. Then she read the margin notation in the surveyor's handwriting, a technical aside added in a smaller script to the northeast quadrant of the map. Blue granite formation, highest density per cubic foot recorded in any northeastern survey conducted between 1918 and 1922. Not suitable for blasting. Must be cut by hand or diamond saw. Eleanor sat with this information for a long moment. 8 months ago, she had walked past Richard's study at 11 at night and heard him on the phone, his voice low and clipped in the way it got when a conversation was not going the way he wanted. She had heard fragments, the right material. European import, the preservation codes require it. She had heard Connor's name and a number that started with 4 million. She had not stopped to listen because she had trained herself over decades not to stop and listen to conversations from which she had been excluded. Connor was importing blue granite from Portugal for a historic preservation project in Philadelphia. He had been searching for a domestic source for months because the import costs were unsustainable, and there was no domestic source, and there had not been a documented northeastern deposit of high-density blue granite in the professional literature for 60 years. Eleanor looked at the cliff face above her. The material Connor was paying a fortune to bring across the Atlantic was directly behind her in quantities sufficient to fulfill a major construction contract on land she had purchased for $5. She set the map carefully on the stone beside her and reached into the oilcloth bundle for the second document. It was a letter written on heavy personal stationery, in a hand that was neither casual nor formal, but possessed the particular clarity of someone who had thought carefully about every word and written it without revision. The ink had faded to brown, but the penmanship held its shape with a firmness that communicated something about the person who had made it. The letter was from a woman named Clara Ashworth. She had written it in 1923, the year she had been forced to leave the property after her husband had taken the household savings and not returned. She addressed it to no one by name, which Eleanor understood immediately. Clara had not known who would find it. She had only known, with the particular certainty of someone who has read terrain as a professional, that the person who found the hollow in the cliff face would have to be able to see what the mountain was offering rather than simply what it was refusing. Clara wrote that she was a self-taught engineer who had identified the mineral spring and the granite deposit and had filed the homestead claim in 1920 with the intention of developing a small water-driven mill. She had been the only woman in the county to file a homestead claim that year. The process had taken 8 months and 3 trips to Albany. Her husband had called it an eccentric hobby until it appeared the claim would succeed, at which point he had called it their project. Then he had taken the money. She wrote about the land with the affection of someone who understood it technically as well as personally, describing the drainage patterns and the frost behavior and the way the spring ran strongest in early April when the snowmelt added pressure to the underground channels. She wrote that the mountain did not resist the people who tried to build on it. It simply required that they listen to it rather than instruct it. Near the end of the letter, she mentioned a silver compass. She had given it, she wrote to her niece Margaret before leaving the property for the last time, a compass that read true, even in poor visibility, with the hope that it would find its way back to this mountain someday when someone who could use it arrived. Eleanor's hands went still. Her grandmother's full name had been Margaret Ashworth Whitmore. Eleanor had known the Ashworth part as a maiden name without ever having occasion to trace it further. She was looking now at a letter written by a woman named Clara Ashworth who had given a silver compass to a niece named Margaret in 1923 from this exact piece of land. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the compass. She turned it over in her palm and looked at the underside at the initials and the date she had read 100 times without ever knowing what they pointed to. CMA INM 1901. Clara May Ashworth. Eleanor Whitfield sat on a shelf of granite in the Adirondack foothills with a century-old letter in her hands and her grandmother's compass in her palm, and the two objects touched each other across 100 years with the quiet inevitability of a calculation that has been working toward its solution for longer than anyone watching could have predicted. She heard the engine of Thomas Briggs' truck coming up the access road, and she did not move. She sat with the documents and the compass and the cliff face and the information about what lay inside it, and she let the weight of it settle into her. The way good foundation material settles slowly, completely, without drama. When Thomas walked through the gate and saw her sitting on the stone with papers in her lap, he stopped and looked at the cliff, then at her, then at the copper cylinder on the rock beside her. He did not ask what she had found. He was a man who understood that some discoveries announce themselves. He sat down on a rock 20 feet away and waited. After a while, Eleanor said, "How long did you work Whitfield jobs?" He said, "Off and on from 2003 to 2015. Last one was the Rosendale retrofit in 2009. She looked at him. "The foundation calculations on that job were the best I ever saw on a Whitfield project," he said. "I was a foreman then. I knew what good structural math looked like, and I knew Richard Whitfield did not do that math." He looked at the cliff face. "Took me 15 years to be standing somewhere I could say that out loud." Eleanor did not respond immediately. She looked down at the surveyor's map in her hands, at the water right notation and the granite deposit in the northeast quadrant, and she thought about what it meant that Thomas Briggs had known since 2009, had carried that knowledge through 15 years of being a man in a world that rewarded silence about such things, and had driven up a mountain road on the strength of a rumor about a woman living in a broken-down tool shed, and was now sitting 20 feet away waiting for her to be ready to tell him what came next. "I have a map," she said, "that shows a documented mineral spring running under this entire property. I have a surveyor's notation about the granite in that cliff face." She paused. "And I have a man named Graves who showed up 3 days ago who already knows about both of those things and is waiting for me to leave so he can file before I do." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a shed full of old-growth cedar from a farm demolition in 2019. Been sitting there 3 years because I didn't know what it was waiting for." He looked at the cliff. Then he looked at the sketch she had made on the napkin, which she had pinned to the rock face with a stone to keep the wind from taking it. "Looks like I do now," he said. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then for the first time since the boardroom, since the 30 days in Haverford, since the 5-hour drive north, and the first freezing night on the dirt floor of the tool shed, she felt something shift in the architecture of the situation. Not hope exactly, something more structural than hope. The recognition that the foundation was not as compromised as she had believed, and that there was, in fact, something to build on. She picked up the surveyor's map and the letter from Clara Ashworth and rolled them carefully back into the oilcloth. There was a great deal of work to do, and Martin Graves had 54 days left to make his move, and Dr. Patricia Okafor was calling back in the morning with information about the legal standing of a 1920 homestead mineral claim. Eleanor Whitfield put the compass in her pocket and stood up. Dr. Patricia Okafor arrived on a Tuesday in late November, driving a university vehicle with a Cornell parking permit still hanging from the mirror, wearing field boots that had seen genuine use, and carrying a canvas bag of instruments that clinked when she walked. She was 45 years old, direct in the way of people who work with physical evidence for a living, and she looked at the cliff face before she looked at Eleanor. "The 1920 survey notation," she said by way of greeting. "Can I see it?" Eleanor gave her the surveyor's map, still in its oilcloth, and watched her read it with the particular stillness of someone processing information they had been hoping to find. Okafor spent 40 minutes with the map and another 2 hours taking samples from the northeast quadrant of the cliff with a core drill that sounded like a dentist's instrument, scaled up for industrial purposes. She collected water from the natural seep at the base of the cliff, tested it with 2 different instruments from her bag, and made notes in a field journal without sharing them until she was done. Then she sat on the same granite shelf where Eleanor had sat when she opened the cylinder, and she laid out what she had found. The water right was documentable. The mineral spring was continuous, measurable, and predated any competing claim in the county record. Under the New York Homestead Act, provisions that govern the 1920 filing a documented water right of this age associated with a claim that had never been formally dissolved through voluntary surrender transferred automatically with the deed in a tax auction sale. Clara Ashworth had never signed a release. She had simply stopped paying taxes. The right had been dormant for 100 years, but dormant was not extinguished. Martin Graves had known this. The blank field on Eleanor's auction documents was not a clerical error. The county recorder who had processed the auction paperwork had on 3 previous occasions over the past decade flagged that same mineral rights field as unresolved in communications with the county assessor's office. The flag had been removed from the public-facing records each time. Okafor said she could not determine who had removed it, but the pattern was readable. Eleanor listened to all of this and said, "How do I file?" Okafor pulled a form from her bag. She had brought it with her. "You fill this out. I attach my field survey as supporting documentation, and you submit it to the county recorder's office in person. The legal standing is not ambiguous once the documentation is present. Graves has no counterclaim because he has no prior interest. He was waiting for you to leave before the 60-day window closed, at which point the county would have taken administrative control and he would have filed as a third-party interested party." "How long have you known about this property?" Eleanor asked. Okafor looked at the cliff. "I've known about a probable northeastern blue granite deposit in this survey region for about 8 years. I've never been able to locate the specific parcel. The 1920 survey was never entered into the state geological database." She paused. "When your intake description mentioned in the 1920 homestead reference, I drove up here the next morning." Eleanor filed the mineral rights confirmation that afternoon at the county recorder's office in Colton. The clerk stamped the form with the date and time and gave her a receipt. Eleanor folded the receipt into the same pocket where she kept the silver compass. Graves came back 6 days later with a man who carried a briefcase and wore a jacket that was too light for the weather, the universal costume of a lawyer trying to project confidence in an unfamiliar environment. Eleanor met them at the gate. She did not open it. She handed Graves a copy of the filed confirmation, the date stamp visible, and Okafor's field survey attached behind it. Graves looked at the date. He looked at the geological documentation. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized as the specific frustration of a man who had planned around a prediction that did not come true. "You can dispute this if you choose," Eleanor said. "You would be disputing a confirmed 1920 homestead mineral right against a field survey from a Cornell geologist in a county filing with a verified date stamp. That is what your money would be paying for." She looked at the lawyer. "Imagine you've told him what that costs and what it yields." The lawyer said nothing. After a moment, Graves took the documents back and walked to his truck. The lawyer followed. They drove down the access road without looking back, and Eleanor watched them go with the flat attention of someone closing an account. The winter that followed was the hardest physical work of Eleanor Whitfield's life, which was a significant statement given the 40 years she had spent correcting other people's structural errors before the world woke up. The frost heave problem in the first foundation came in the second week of December, after a deep cold snap followed by 3 days of temperatures that climbed above freezing. Eleanor had calculated for frost penetration based on the published depth data for the county, but the northeast corner of the site had a microclimate. She had not fully accounted for a cold air drainage pattern from the upper cliff that kept the soil temperature lower and the freeze-thaw cycling more aggressive than the surrounding terrain. The foundation cracked along a line she had predicted would be stable. She and Thomas dug it out and started again this time, with 8 additional inches of insulating gravel below the footing. The second version held. Thomas did not mention the first version after they fixed it. This was not indifference. Eleanor understood after the third week of working alongside him that he operated by a discipline she recognized from the best structural engineers she had known. You address the failure, you correct the design, and you do not carry the failure forward as a story about yourself. Richard had done the opposite, treating every setback as a referendum on his identity, and therefore something to be concealed or attributed elsewhere. The contrast was not lost on her, and she did not remark on it because she did not need to. They worked 6 days a week through January and February, Thomas arriving before 7 most mornings with coffee in a thermos, in the particular companionable silence of a man who understood that not all work required conversation. Ruth came on Saturdays with food and stayed through the afternoon, sitting near the work area with her knitting and occasionally offering observations that were more perceptive than they appeared. It was Ruth who noticed in the third week of January that Eleanor had stopped dating her sketchbook entries. "You're not marking the days anymore," she said, not as a question. Eleanor looked at the current page. Ruth was right. She had been marking every page with the date since she arrived in October, a habit from the boardroom era, when she had documented her work with the compulsive thoroughness of someone who understood that records were the only protection available to her. She looked at the undated page and understood what it meant. She was no longer building a case. She was just building. The first cabin took shape through February, with the particular beauty of a structure that has been designed to belong to its location rather than impose upon it. The blue granite walls of the northeast face caught the morning light in a way Eleanor had calculated from the survey maps, but had not fully visualized until she saw it in person, the stone holding the cold blue of early morning and releasing it slowly through the day. Thomas had been right about the cedar. Old growth material has a density and stability that modern lumber cannot replicate, and where it met the granite in the corner joints, the two materials held each other with a specificity that looked organic. "First time I've built something that looks like it was always supposed to be here," Thomas said one afternoon, standing back from the northeast wall. Eleanor was behind him with her sketchbook. She wrote the line down without comment because it was the most accurate description of what they were doing that she had heard, and she intended to use it. The second and third cabins went faster. By April, the snow was receding from the lower site, and the natural drainage channels Eleanor had designed were handling the snowmelt exactly as she had calculated, directing it through the gravel beds and into the storage cisterns she and Thomas had built into the base of the cliff, fed by the mineral spring that Claire Ashworth had identified a century earlier, and that now supplied 3 structures with clean water drawn by gravity alone, requiring no pump, no electrical connection, no ongoing mechanical maintenance. Okafor photographed the water system for her field documentation, and without asking Eleanor's permission, shared the photographs with a colleague who wrote about sustainable building systems. The colleague shared them with an editor. In May, Eleanor received an email from Architectural Digest. She had 6 weeks of complete design documentation ready to send because she had been recording her work with the compulsive thoroughness of someone who had once watched their life's work disappear into a dumpster and had decided that would not happen again. Whitfield Hillside opened in June with 3 cabins, a small common structure built into the rock face using a technique Eleanor had developed specifically for the site, in a gravel path system that followed the natural contours of the terrain so precisely that it was invisible from the valley below. The name she chose required no deliberation. Not the mountain's name, not the land's name. Her name applied to something she had built for the first time in her adult life as an act of ownership rather than inheritance. The first guests arrived the following weekend, referred by Okafor's professional network. By the end of June, the cabin calendar was full through August. By August, there was a waiting list extending into the following spring. The black Cadillac Escalade appeared on the access road on a Friday afternoon in late July. moving with the careful deliberateness of a vehicle whose driver was unfamiliar with the road's surface conditions. Eleanor was on the upper deck of the main cabin with her sketchbook when she heard it. She did not go down immediately. She finished the notation she was making about the fourth cabin's southern exposure and then walked down the exterior stairs to the ground level and waited. Connor got out first. He was wearing a suit that was correct for an office in Philadelphia and wrong for everything about where he was standing. He looked at the granite walls and the cedar framing and the way the structure pressed itself into the cliff with an expression Eleanor recognized as a specific disorientation of a man encountering something he cannot immediately categorize. Diane followed her designer bag held close in the way of someone who is not sure what the ground will do under their feet. Thomas was in the wood shop at the lower site. Eleanor had not asked him to be visible. He was simply there. Connor crossed the gravel to the base of the deck stairs and looked up at her. He began with concern. He was worried about her, he said. The isolation, the conditions, the physical demands at her age. He had spoken to her doctor, he said, which was a lie Eleanor identified immediately since she had transferred her medical records to a practice in Colton 3 months earlier and had not informed him. He said that he and Diane had discussed it and that there were options, comfortable options closer to family, and that the mountain had clearly been an interesting experience, but that it was time to think practically. Eleanor let him finish. Connor, she said, what are you paying per cubic meter for the Lisbon granite right now? He stopped. I know the figure within 10% because Patricia Okafor told me in March, and I know it has gone up since then because the project is behind schedule and the import logistics have deteriorated. I also know that your contract with the Philadelphia Preservation Authority requires material that meets the 1910 historical specification and that the Lisbon stone is failing spot inspections at a rate that is going to trigger a material substitution clause before the end of the quarter. Connor's face had gone very still. Your father came to this mountain, Eleanor said. I don't know how many times. I know he found the hollow in the cliff face because the cylinder I found inside it was the same one I saw in his safe in 2011. He knew what was in this cliff, and he chose not to tell me. He spent 14 months before his death transferring assets and constructing a legal situation designed to ensure I would have no resources to act on anything he had not authorized. She looked at her son steadily. I would like you to understand that clearly, not as a grievance, as a fact about the foundation of everything you inherited. Connor said nothing. The blue granite in this cliff has been independently certified by Cornell's Applied Geology Department. The mineral rights have been confirmed and registered with Colton County since November. I signed a materials supply agreement with Meridian Construction in May. The name landed the way she had known it would. Meridian was the firm that had been second to Whitfield Construction on the Philadelphia Preservation contract that had contested the award that had the project management capacity to absorb a major granite supply relationship and the motive to use it as leverage. Connor knew Meridian's principals personally and not well. The agreement gives Meridian exclusive access to the Northeast Quarry, faced for a period of 5 years at a price per cubic meter that is 40% below what you are currently paying for imports. Eleanor paused. You had one window to negotiate a different arrangement. You closed it when you handed me an eviction notice. Diane had not spoken. She stood at the edge of the gravel with her bag still held close, but something in her posture had shifted during Eleanor's words, a tightening that was not defiance but something closer to recognition. She looked at the cabin walls at the mineral spring outlet where the water ran clear and steady from the base of the cliff into a channel Thomas had lined with flat stones. She looked at the deck and the cedar framing and the way the entire structure occupied its site. Mom, she said, and her voice was quiet in a way Eleanor had not heard from her daughter in a very long time. I didn't know about the house transfer. I found out the same day as the reading. I should have told you. I should have said something. Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment. Diane was 39 years old and she had her father's capacity for calculation, and Eleanor now believed more of her mother's conscience than she had ever been encouraged to exercise. You knew before the reading that you were not going to be surprised, Eleanor said. That is not the same as not knowing, but I understand the difference between active participation and silence, and I am willing to let that distinction stand. Diane absorbed this without deflecting it. One dinner, Eleanor said. Saratoga Springs, next spring. That is what I have to offer. It was not forgiveness extended without conditions. It was a door left open at a width that corresponded precisely to what had been earned. Diane nodded and did not ask for more. Connor tried once more. The offer was $100,000 framed as generosity for the full parcel. Eleanor did not respond to the number. She looked at the cliff face and then back at him with the expression of a woman who has calculated the load-bearing requirements of a structure and found the proposed support inadequate by an order of magnitude. "Use the door," she said. Connor looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that was more complicated than anger. A recognition, perhaps, that the woman he had handed a $1,200 check to 8 months ago was not the woman standing in front of him now, or perhaps had never been the woman he had believed her to be, which was a different and more unsettling thing to absorb. He turned and walked back to the Escalade. Diane followed and looked back once from the passenger door before getting in. Eleanor watched them down the access road until the sound of the engine dropped below the ridgeline. Then she walked to the wood shop and stood in the doorway. Thomas looked up from the cedar board he was planing. "They're gone," she said. He set the plane down. "How'd it go?" "The way it needed to." He nodded and picked up the plane again, and Eleanor went back to the upper deck and her sketchbook in the fourth cabin's southern exposure, and the afternoon continued. She was in the main cabin 3 weeks later, reviewing structural drawings for the fourth cabin's east-facing window, when her phone buzzed with a news alert she had not set up. One of Okafor's colleagues had forwarded it without comment, the way people forward things they believe you need to see but are not sure how to introduce. The headline was from the Philadelphia Inquirer's business section. Whitfield Construction had received a stop work order on the Penn's Landing Preservation Project after a structural engineering review board found load calculation errors in the secondary support system of the facade installation. The article quoted a city inspector describing the errors as fundamental, the kind of thing that gets caught in peer review. The article also noted that Whitfield Construction had been struggling for months to source compliant granite for the project facade, and that the company had recently lost its primary European supplier contract due to payment delays. Eleanor set the phone face down on the drafting table. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the particular quietness of watching a building settle into the consequences of its own design. Connor had submitted those calculations without anyone to check them, without the invisible correction process that had run beneath the surface of every Whitfield construction project for 20 years. The errors were his. They had always been his. The difference now was that there was no one standing behind him in the pre-dawn hours to find them before they reached the inspector's desk. The stop work order became a contract termination within 2 weeks. The breach of contract penalty was assessed at $2.3 million. Whitfield Construction filed for Chapter 11 protection before the end of the month, and the bankruptcy trustee's office flagged the 2023 transfer of the Haverford estate as a potentially preferential transaction made within 2 years of insolvency. The clawback proceedings that followed were lengthy but conclusive. The house sold under legal compulsion at a value well below its assessment, and the proceeds joined the creditors' pool. Diane's personal assets structured into the company through the inheritance agreement were reduced by the proceedings to a fraction of what she had held in July. She moved from her Rittenhouse Square apartment to a 2-bedroom rental in Germantown. She sent Eleanor a letter in December that ran to 4 pages and said in various registers and with varying degrees of directness that she was sorry. Eleanor read it twice, set it on the desk, and did not respond immediately. She was not certain yet what response was honest, and honesty was the only currency she was still interested in spending. Connor's attorney contacted her in January through a formal letter that described his circumstances without asking for anything directly, which was its own kind of asking. Eleanor sat with the letter for 3 days. She thought about the check for $1,200 sliding across the mahogany table. The practiced boredom in Connor's voice, the sound of the architectural model hitting the bottom of the trash receptacle in the hallway. She thought about what it meant to be reduced to a number and what the right response to that was from a person who had chosen not to become something diminished in return for what had been done to her. She called her bank and set up a private trust. Monthly disbursement of $1,200 to Connor Whitfield with a single condition attached: no contact with Eleanor Whitfield or any business associate of Whitfield Hillside, direct or indirect. The amount was not chosen for cruelty, and it was not chosen for charity. It was chosen because it was the number Connor had selected to represent the value of a human being's 4 decades of labor, and Eleanor believed that a person should be required to live with the standards they imposed on others long enough to understand them from the inside. Thomas asked her about it one evening on the deck after she had come back from the post office with the trust confirmation documents. The light was going amber over the western ridge, and the mineral spring was audible from where they sat, its rhythm so consistent and present by now that Eleanor heard it the way you hear your own heartbeat only when you are paying attention. "Does it feel the way you thought it would?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "It feels quieter," she said. "I expected something sharper." "That's usually how it goes," Thomas said. "Justice doesn't sound like what the movies say. It sounds like a door closing on an empty room." She thought about that for a while. A door closing on an empty room. The right sound for the right conclusion. Not triumphant, not vengeful, simply finished. The Whitfield Women's Workshop came from a question Ruth asked in October during one of her Saturday visits, while Eleanor was reviewing the structural drawings for the fourth cabin. "If someone had told you at 45 that you had time left to start something of your own," Ruth said without looking up from her knitting, "would you have left sooner?" Eleanor set her pencil down. She did not answer that evening because the honest answer required more consideration than the question's simplicity suggested. She thought about it for 3 weeks, and what she arrived at was not a direct answer, but a recognition the question Ruth had asked was one that hundreds of women were sitting with right now and had no place to take it. The workshop announcement went up in February. It was not a motivational program. It was not a retreat. It was a 5-day residential session for women over 50, held at Whitfield Hillside, structured around a single working principle that Eleanor had developed from her own experience. Before you can build anything that lasts, you have to identify which walls in your current life are load-bearing and which ones only look like they are. The first session filled in 11 days. The second filled before the first ended. Eleanor taught it herself, with Ruth handling the logistical details and Thomas occasionally appearing to demonstrate in physical and concrete terms what it looked like to work with material that was honest about its own properties. The women who came were not uniform in their circumstances, but they shared something Eleanor recognized immediately: the specific fatigue of people who have been structurally essential to systems that did not acknowledge them. Teachers, accountants, nurses, a retired federal judge, a woman who had run the administrative operations of her husband's law firm for 22 years without a title. They came carrying the particular exhaustion of the invisible, and they left most of them with something Eleanor could not name precisely, but recognized as the look of a person who has located the difference between what they were told they were and what they actually were. It was the most useful work she had ever done, including the bridges. 3 years after she had first driven a sedan with $4,000 in her account up a frost-heaved road to a $5 parcel in the Adirondack foothills, Eleanor Whitfield sat at the desk in the main cabin on a morning in late September and read an email from a fifth-year architecture student at Penn State. The student was writing a thesis on embedded sustainable systems in residential design. She had been directed to Whitfield Hillside by a professor in the structural engineering department who had used the water delivery system as a case study in a graduate seminar. She wanted to know if she could come up and talk about the design process. Penn State, the school Eleanor had graduated from in 1978 with a degree she had never been permitted to use under her own name, the credential that Richard had called too good for the corporate world, on the same afternoon he asked her to quit and come home. Eleanor read the email a second time, not from sentiment, but from the specific pleasure of an engineer verifying a calculation. The math of it was clean. 43 years from graduation to the moment a student from the same institution was asking to learn from her. Not from Richard Whitfield, not from the estate of Whitfield Construction, but from Eleanor Margaret Whitfield, architect of record. She typed back, "Yes, come up on a Thursday. Bring your sketchbook." That was all it needed to be. On a morning in early October, Eleanor was on the deck before sunrise with tea that was still too hot to drink, watching the sky go from black to the particular deep blue that preceded the first light in the east. Thomas was inside. She could hear him moving in the kitchen, the specific sound of a person who has learned the geography of a space through months of daily use. Ruth had stayed the night in the second cabin after a long evening of planning for the spring workshop session. The fourth cabin was finished. Its roofline followed the natural break of the cliff above it so precisely that from the valley road 2 miles away, it was not a building so much as a feature of the terrain. Eleanor had designed it that way deliberately, not to hide it, but to honor a principle Claire Ashworth had written down in 1923, and that Eleanor had understood when she read it as the one instruction she had been following without knowing it for her entire professional life, build in the image of the land, not against it. The light came over the eastern ridge and found the quartz vein in the main cliff face, the same vein that had shown Eleanor what the mountain was made of on the morning after the worst night of her life. And the stone did what it always did, held the light for a moment, and then distributed it into the surrounding rock in a way that made the whole face luminous for about 4 minutes before the angle changed and the effect passed. Eleanor watched it without moving. She was 68 years old when she had driven away from Haverford with $4,000 and a $5 deed and 41 years of knowledge that had been used by everyone except her. She was 71 now, and the knowledge had not changed, and the Adirondacks had not changed, and the mineral spring ran under everything she had built here with the same steady and indifferent consistency that it had maintained for the century before she arrived. What had changed was the name on the door. Not the Whitfield name, though that was part of it. The name on the door was the name of someone who had decided to stop asking for permission to occupy the space her own work had created. The name on the door belonged to a woman who had built 4 cabins and a workshop program and a water system that required no external power and a professional reputation that had arrived late and on her own terms, exactly as it should. There was a student coming on Thursday with a sketchbook. There was a dinner in Saratoga Springs in the spring, one dinner with her daughter at a table in a quiet restaurant on terms that were honest. There was a trust account that disbursed $1,200 a month to an address in Philadelphia quietly without ceremony, the way that certain kinds of reckoning work best. There was Thomas in the kitchen making coffee, and Ruth in the second cabin, and the mineral spring under everything, and the granite that Clara Ashworth had mapped 100 years ago and left for the woman who would know what to do with it. Eleanor picked up her tea. It had cooled to the right temperature. She drank it and watched the light move across the stone and thought about the 4th cabin's east-facing window and whether the transom height was exactly right or whether there was one more adjustment to make, and concluded there was a small one, and opened her sketchbook to a clean page. She was not finished. She had never been finished. That was the whole point.